Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss The Killer, starring Michael Fassbender, Russ Howard, Charles Purnell, Carrie O'Malley, Sala Baker, Sophie Charlotte, and Tilda Swinton, directed by David Fincher. First of all, this is available on Netflix if you want to stream that on Netflix before you see the movie. And welcome back to David Fincher, as I did this series about 2 or 3 years ago, something like that, whenever that time was. And I started from 7, as I've already reviewed Alien 3 and Mank, going all the way to Gone Girl. And yeah, I did do Mank at one point for the Oscars. And now I'm here for The Killer. So let's see what this movie is. Is it based on a graphic novel? And will it follow the graphic novel well? My honest opinion, I have heard that it doesn't follow it quite well, as this kind of reminds me of a Punisher story. Let's get into it and you'll see what I'm talking about. We start with the opening credits that goes by very quickly as we get introduced to the killer, played by Michael Fassbender, in Chapter 1 at the location of Paris, France, as his next kill is the target, as he waits for the target day after day so he can get his shot, as he talks about how Paris has a shit ton of McDonald's all over the Paris, as there's 1,500, while the killer does yoga, listens to music, and eats some McDonald's. And I also noticed he smashes a lot of cellular phones for tracking reasons, obviously, which did bother me a little bit while waiting for a perfect shot. And the cinematography looks good, as this movie is well made by director David Fincher. The killer tries to take a shot at night and ends up killing a woman called the Dominatrix, which is a woman the target wants to have sex with. So basically, she's a prostitute by definition. So he accidentally kills her, and the target covers the window, and the killer realizes he's fucked and takes the gun back to its original parts calmly, and as he runs away calmly, and he gets away from the cops calmly, and it works as a thriller. But I'm having an okay time watching this on Netflix, as it did come to some theaters, but I didn't go to theaters for this, as it has a good concept, but the way it's executed is unfortunately not as great as I wanted it to be. The killer switches clothes at a gas station, bathroom of course, as he cleans up his mess and calls a taxi cab to the airport, as he has different identities and many different passports, and he sees a dog who can possibly sniff the fact he's in serious trouble, and works on being calm and breathing, and calls his boss, who happens to be Hodges, aka the lawyer, played by Charles Parnell, as I reviewed him before in Transformers Age of Extinction, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, and Top Gun Maverick, as he gets to a different location where he stays one night at a hotel, and he gets to the airport the next day, and there's not really any character I could connect with except for the killer himself, as Michael Fassbender gives one of his best performances here in this movie. We get to Chapter 2 in Dominican Republic, which happens to be the hideout, and we learn he lives there with I'm believing his wife Magdala, played by Sophie Charlotte, who's in the hospital with her brother Marcus, as he sees his house was broken in by some criminals, and his house is torn apart with blood, and he rushes to the hospital and sees Magdala and Marcus, and he explains what the fuck happened to her, as a couple of criminals put her in the hospital, as he describes one as a woman that looks like a toothpick. No, Q-tip, excuse me. And they come in a taxi cab driven by someone who will meet in a few minutes, as the doctor puts her in a private hospital by the killer's request, and Magdala wakes up and chats briefly with the killer, and the hospital scene made me think he's going to go after the real villains behind this plot, as this is like almost any revenge movie, like a repeat of any action movie with Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, or Mel Gibson, or The Punisher, like I brought up before. But luckily he doesn't scream it to the heavens, as that would have been cliche. And how many times have I seen that in this movie? Well, believe it or not, it's quite a few times. We get to the killer cleaning up his house and go into a different country, where he finds a taxi cab driver named Leo and endlessly waits for him, and sees him driving in a taxi cab and follows him and takes a taxi cab with Leo driving and eventually points a gun at Leo. And Leo gets scared and tells the killer everything he knows about the two motherfuckers that broke into his house. And they go under a bridge in a quiet place where the killer shoots Leo, and the dialogue was badly written by as the actors, with an exception of Fassbender, was dull. And I don't expect dull from a dull thriller from David Fincher. We move on to chapter 3 in New Orleans, where he goes for Hodges, aka the lawyer, but first he has to get a gun and a different license plate from Louisiana, as well as a recycle sticker, and he goes to the hardware store to pick up some things, even a trash can that you wheel out for trash day. And he gets to the lawyer's office and sees Dolores, played by Carrie O'Malley, whom I have reviewed as Mrs. Higgins in the first 2 Annabelle films, and Terminator Genisys, which was an unfortunate movie, as the killer gets in at the same time as the FedEx man and analyzes how long the door will stay open, and he goes in after the FedEx man leaves and goes after Dolores and Hodges, and he kills Hodges and lets Doris go as she asks him to not leave anything behind to lead into either himself or Dolores, which was a funny piece of this dialogue, as that made me laugh when it is not supposed to be funny. For example, they get in the elevator and some guy says something about getting rid of a body, which did make Dolores laugh, as well as me, which made me laugh unintentionally at best. And she traps Dolores in the van in the garage, and I believe was her house, which was an interesting choice. While in Dolores' house, he finds out who was responsible for his house being broken into, and as it turns out, it's Claiborne, aka the client, played by Arliss Howard, whom I reviewed in Mank in The Lost World Jurassic Park, as was in The Time Traveler's Wife and Moneyball. And he kills Dolores, and her falling down the stairs unfortunately didn't look too real to me, as it kind of looked like a dummy, honestly. The killer goes on a boat with his van and disguises it as many of the other vans, and he drives to Florida, leading to chapter 4, where we meet the Brute, played by Salah Baker, whom I reviewed in Deadpool 2 and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, as he was in The Mandalorian, as the killer follows the Brute around while he has a pit bull dog who loves and protects the Brute at all costs. And the killer feeds the dog some sleeping pills and waits by his truck and enters the property of the Brute while in the shower. And as the Brute is about to get out of the shower and the killer is about to kill him, the Brute and the killer have a fight, which was a brutal and absolutely violent fight. And this is probably the best fight in this whole movie, as it was reminding me of the 2004 Punisher movie with the Punisher versus the Russian, as it was giving me those vibes. And that's probably why I like this action scene. The dog hears gunshots as the killer killed the Brute, and the killer gets away from the dog rather quickly, and he burns the house down. And what I found interesting, and not in a very good choice, is the dog didn't hear the fight going on, as dogs have a better sense of hearing than humans, as far as I'm concerned. That was a little problematic, in my opinion, as this movie has problems for sure. We move on to chapter 5 in New York to get to the expert, played by Tilda Swinton, the one that looks like a Q-tip, as he follows her to a restaurant and goes to her table and chats with her as he points a gun at her as she's having a few drinks and he only has one. And Tilda Swinton was a little unrecognizable in the film, sure, in this role. And I did like that, as I don't really get to know her in this movie, as she has one scene which kind of disappointed me as far as I can tell you. The killer takes the expert outside to Central Park, and the expert trips as she was going to kill the killer with a knife, but he shoots her dead with a gun right away. And I've heard this saying before, never bring a knife to a gunfight, which was a cliche choice, but I was okay with it. We move on to chapter 6, which is in Chicago, where he's going after the client, aka Claiborne, as he can't get in and gets a fob copier from Amazon, and he becomes a member of, let me see if I'm saying this right, Baliquinix or Knox or something. I don't know how you say that name. Anyways, moving on, which is some kind of club, and the killer buys a gun from a gun dealer and picks up his Amazon package. and goes in the club and gets a place to copy the key fob in the parking garage, and that's how he gets in Claiborne's place, and the killer points the gun at Claiborne, telling them they have a problem, and he says there's no problem between each other. While they have a conversation that ends with the killer saying to Claiborne their paths better not cross again, otherwise a slow death, which did feel a little strange. And the epilogue back to the Dominican Republic, and the killer is back home with Magdala, and this climax was strange, as this is the weakest of David Fincher's likable films in my opinion, and we'll see when I rate the movie. Now it's time for my rating. I'll give this movie a 5.5 out of 10. The cinematography looks good, as this is well shot by director David Fincher, but at the end of the day, the movie was just alright, as it's not the best thriller he's done, as I reviewed them all of his movies, including Alien 3, which is beyond the pits, but from Seven to Gone Girl. But don't get me wrong, it's better than Mink and Benjamin Button, as those are the two I don't ever want to watch again. And I'll watch this one any time than those two films. And this does have a good concept based on a graphic novel, but the way it's executed on screen was unfortunately not as great as I wanted it to be, as David Fincher has made better thrillers than this. The dialogue is unintentionally funny at times, as it was performed badly, as the performances, with an exception of Michael Fassbender, was dull, as the characters I can't connect with other than Fassbender. And I did like that line, and I did like the action scene with the killer and the brute, and it was giving me a vibe of the 2004 Punisher film, as it was the best scene in the movie. I was a little disappointed by the way the movie was shown on screen, as it was well made by David Fincher, sure, as I would watch Seven, Fight Club, The Social Network, and Gone Girl, and somewhat Panic Room over this movie, as this felt the most disappointing out of David Fincher's resume, like Panic Room, but it was just an okay movie for me, as it was an okay time watching so far, that the reason I'm going to give it a mild recommendation, as this is his weakest films I've liked from David Fincher, and I didn't like The Game, Benjamin Button, or Mank, as those are the weakest, whereas this would go around the territory of Panic Room in my opinion. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and until David Fincher comes out with another movie, have a good evening.